There's something incredibly impoverished and narrow and myopic and dangerous about living inside the contemporary, it seems to me, actually. To live one's life entirely within the contemporary seems an act of sort of dangerous intolerance, in a way, of the experience of the past whose heirs we self-evidently are. So, in some sense, Cicero was correct, I believe, when he said that to have no knowledge or understanding, but no wish to understand the past, restricts one to the mental life of a small child, really small child, an infant, actually, who has no understanding or needs no understanding of where we've come from, and therefore has no understanding of whither we go.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the Doones to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromous. This is Byrne Power coming to you from an overcast but what's going to be a very warm day here in Tbilisi, Georgia. And what we're going to do today is nothing original. This is a summary of the How We Got Here series, the exact same summary featured in How We Got Here number 13. And the reason it's here is because someone made a suggestion, which I thought was a reasonable suggestion, that they just wished they had that section to use to show their kids in a classroom or something, to give an alternative version of history. And since I did it takes an hour, but that's fairly succinct as far as history goes, they thought that might be useful. So that's what we're going to get. If you've watched this already, congratulations for making it this far into the video. Your view will be noted by the algorithmic deities. Speaking of algorithmic deities, have you subscribed yet? Have you liked the video? That seems to help somebody. And you can contribute to the channel through PayPal, link below. And do that. Every contributor to the channel is welcome, and there are audio extras for people who fall in certain categories. Read below. All right, so let us do a summary, a historical overview related to the subject of how we got to where we are today. And this does not include the 2020 material, but it goes right up to the beginning of 2020 and stops. But it is something that I think you will find, this is good just to listen to, put on in the background. I did it all as vocal and then added the images later, so it doesn't matter if you watch it or listen to it. Enjoy. Let's get into the summary. And this is going to be a summary of everything we've covered in all 12 earlier How We Got Here episodes. And one of my main points is that all of this starts as a result of the psychic damage of World War II. And I've had a few people say to me, but that was such a long time ago. To which my response is, that was hardly yesterday. There are people alive who fought in World War II, who lived during World War II. It's not that far back in history. And the thing you have to remember about it is that this was a massive global conflagration that makes anything we've seen since then look like a campfire cookout with marshmallows. And that includes September 11th, it includes the COVID, it includes everything. Because 70 to 85 million people, estimates vary, died in 6 years, a little longer if you include what happened in China. And what even comes close to that now? And what's strange is so many people today are under the illusion that this is the big event. And I think it's just narcissism, really. But I know it's more than that. It has to do with the fact that we are completely surrounded by propaganda, and the propaganda eats our heads. And what is so massively different about now is that as the propaganda eats our minds, it gives us the illusion that these are the worst of all times. And yet World War II is an event so big, most people still can't comprehend it. And it's made worse by the fact that the study of history, the rumination, the meditation upon the meaning of history has practically disappeared in popular culture. Except, of course, for the, shall we say, woke versions of it. And there's right-wing propaganda versions of history as well, and conspiracy versions of it, most of which I just want to flip the finger at and just say, just shut up and really go study history and get your mind out of the websites you go to all the time where people are passing information around like ants clicking feelers as they go by. But how does this affect us? Well, first of all, you have to understand how much of the world was destroyed. Much of Europe, great swaths of Asia were destroyed. People in the Americas didn't feel it so much, although it involved quite a few countries. I mean, if you would go to places like Manila in the Philippines, Nanking in China, Warsaw in Poland, Berlin in Germany, Kiev in the Ukraine, if you were to just see the vast swaths of damage after the war, what happens after some traumatic event hits a person? Well, one thing they often do is they just keep moving on. They try not to think about it. They try not to bring it up. You'll often hear people say things like, do we have to go over that again? Do we have to talk about that stuff again? It's so depressing. But that's part of the damage, not being able to face it. In America, there was a pretense of normality. And this is when, television comes up and the new suburbs come into existence. And you have the superhighways. The automobile takes over life. And there was a certain idea of the family, which, by the way, is the normality most people refer back to today that they want, which I think is highly suspicious because 50s normality wasn't normal. Camille Paglia makes a great point of saying that what was normal for most people in most countries was the larger extended family. And the nuclear family from the 50s, mom, dad, and 2.3 kids, or whatever it was, that was abnormal. And I'm living here in Tbilisi, Georgia, and everyone's connected to larger families here, which, interestingly enough, and I don't think this is an accident, kind of lessens the amount of insanity, public insanity you see. But I've talked about this in other places. But also in this environment was the Cold War. And the extreme suspicion of the communists and the democracies against each other. And throw into that the atomic bomb, spies, the McCarthy hearings, these kinds of things. And you have a very, very powerful situation. Now, what I tend to think is that America and the West had to turn on their propaganda machines to fight Nazi Germany. and the Axis powers, because they were so effective, particularly the fact that America had a very large German population. It was very effective propaganda. The Japanese propaganda was very effective. The Italian less so. But in order to fight it, we had to make our own propaganda. And also to fight it, we had to do things which we at first said, this is immoral. No one should do this. No one should drop bombs on random civilians and things. And we went ahead and did that. And as an aside, America in particular, got addicted to dropping bombs to solve problems. And this would show up for the rest of, up until the present, the rest of American military history. The addiction to bombs to solve problems so that the people at home wouldn't have to cry too much about all the people who were being lost in the war. And the one time we didn't really do that in Vietnam, things went to hell. But anyway, what happened was, I think the propaganda machine got turned on. And because of the immediate effect of the Cold War, it was just left on. And has been left on ever since. And this is not a small thing. I think this poisons our mind far more than anything else that has happened since then. And this is part of what happened in World War II. During the 50s, the post-war period, the right wing dominated the propaganda mills. You can think of the McCarthy hearings. You can think of, there were quite a few Senate hearings. You know, they were going after comic books and going after folk singers and anybody they could find that was either left-wing or interested in some sort of social justice or something. They were going after those people. It created this unsettling effect where, on one hand, the surface of America was normality. It was like Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons, these television shows, the Ozzie and Harriet show, this surface level normality. But underneath it, just a bit, were all of these seething tensions, giving rise to things like the folk protest movement, the civil rights movement, the Beats or beatniks, and also, in Europe, existentialism. And these kinds of movements, also in Europe, there were modern art movements that had some quite edgy ideas connected to them, as well as the fact that socialism and communism started to have a real hearing in Western Europe. Obviously, in Eastern Europe, what would be on the other side of the Iron Curtain, they were just completely inundated and taken over by the Soviet communists. But even in the West, in Western Europe, in France, in Italy, in Portugal, in numbers of countries, the left-wing movements grew and grew. And part of the reason they grew is because they based a lot of their appeal upon Christian morality of civil rights and social justice and such. Those are coming from Christianity. They're not coming from anywhere else. They're not coming from existentialism. They're not coming from Nietzsche. They're not coming from Hinduism. They're not coming from Buddhism. They're coming from Christianity with its concern about those without a voice. But then it takes those ideas, this leftist idea that would eventually spring into things like liberation theology in Latin America and other forms of thought. It takes these ideas and presents the romantic dream of social change. But then it exchanges that for authoritarianism because, well, we have to do something to get the social change. And this is also something that has obviously come down to us today. Along with that was another thing which was kind of a different order. And this is the birth of rock and roll, which was, my feeling was that 1950s rock and roll was a rejection of the sterility of a society of relaxation and paranoia. And you can really see this relaxation if you look at the easy listening records that the parents were listening to of people, floating back in their their easy chairs and kind of like wanting the new world just to be good. We don't want what happened to us, the Depression and World War II and all this stuff, to happen to you. So we're going to give you everything. Hence, the baby boomers, now just shorthand, the boomers. And interestingly enough, though, this generation that was born around the time of World War II, a little bit before, a little bit after, and would go through and come of age in the 1960s, was in fact, I would say, the most educated generation of students we'd ever come with. Now, some people will say, well, no, students today are far more educated. And to which I reply, well, what are you calling education? You know, if you're talking about access to computers and they have access to all of this knowledge, yeah, okay. But if you're talking about actual intellectual firepower, no. I mean, people today, one of our problems is no one knows how to talk anymore. And that's part of an intelligent civil discourse, which has been lost. And I would say about 1960 was the high point of American culture. As far as, you know, our money ruled the world. We had prestige from helping Europe and Japan, find their way back to life. We helped rebuild through the Marshall Plan so much of what had been destroyed. They owed us money, of course, but that's another issue. But also, I would say the college students were very intelligent around 1960 and into the 60s. It wouldn't last because they had also been infected by all the rebellion, the new propaganda, which was going to fight the old propaganda. And here's the problem. The new propaganda is coming from communism, but that's anyone who says it's all communism or it's all socialist doesn't really understand. That's why rock and roll is so important, because rock and roll is something else. It's a rejection of the sterility, which really was there. And also there were hints of a sexual revolution coming with things like the Kinsey Report and Playboy magazine. Then comes the first blow, the first major blow, although it was primarily an American event, but this also had global ramifications. And this first blow was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And of course, happened in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. And of course, anyone who was alive and conscious at that point, much like during September 11th in 2001, hint, spoiler, blow number 2, can remember where they were when it happened. I was only 7 years old, but I can remember where I was. I can remember I just moved from Hawaii, where I'd lived a couple of years as a kid, to California in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I remember people crying. I remember turning on an old black and white television set and getting the news and being sent home early and girls kind of walking together and crying together. And, no one quite knew what it meant, but we watched the television for the next, weekend and took in the stuff and then watched Lee Harvey Oswald get shot by Ruby. And, we watched the different ceremonies of grief. And it was like something radical had changed. That was at the end of 1963. Look what happens in 1964. It's not all directly connected to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but it's all supercharged by that event. So, 1964, the Beatles come to America, and young girls in particular go crazy. Their presidential father has been killed, and now these young romantic swains are coming to America, and it's like it's never been a world without the Beatles since then. 1964, Bob Dylan changes. He actually starts this right after Kennedy's assassination. He changes from folk music to beat-inspired surrealistic imagery. And folk rock is born. Songwriters all over have to change how they approach their lyrics. It was Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook recently who said how important the Beatles were, and that their music really changed the world. to which I would agree. The one thing they left out is there would be no second act Beatles, the Beatles that really changed everything, without Bob Dylan saying to them, you guys aren't singing about anything. You're singing She Loves You, yeah, 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 and It's a Hard Day's Night. What is this? While Dylan is writing things like It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. He's writing Like a Rolling Stone. And they suddenly realize, oh man, we got to get with the program. Well, they weren't the only ones. Jimi Hendrix is inspired both by the Beatles and by Bob Dylan to change not only his lyrics, but the music itself. Now, anything could happen. Also, there was the hippie movement that's totally inspired by Bob Dylan, which also brings us to 1964, Ken Kesey's trip across America in a bus called Further. And this is the first real manifestation of the hippie movement and the psychedelic revolution of San Francisco coming up later. Then we have the free speech movement across the bay in Berkeley, and this is essentially the birth of the new left. It's more complicated than that, but essentially this is what's going on here. Then there's the Harlem Riot in the summer in 1964 in New York City, followed over the years by Philadelphia, also in 64, Watts, Detroit, Newark, all these other places. Hundreds of riots. I don't know if hundreds, but dozens of riots, certainly. And then 1964 is essentially when the Vietnam War starts, which probably wouldn't have started had Kennedy stayed alive. And all of these things were amplified by Kennedy. Now, the San Francisco scene is starting to grow in the spotlight. And what's happening is it's growing with this new kind of attitude towards everything. What's the big difference? LSD, acid, psychedelics. You take the beat movement and you add psychedelics to it, and now you have the hippie movement. And the hippie movement was not about radical politics. It was primarily about just dropping out and tuning out, tuning in and dropping out, float downstream, according to Timothy Leary. It was essentially looking for truth inside oneself through technology. Believe me, drugs are a technology. And that is what happens. And so between 1966 and 1967, for instance, rock music changes utterly in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, London, New York City, Detroit, and other places. And it brings the folk protest movement and the beat movement and psychedelics and the new philosophical lyrics of Dylan and the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests and modernism and the sexual revolution together to create a new counterculture, which leads to a new art movement in, for instance, San Francisco, all these weird underground posters on underground comics, to the first rock festival in Monterey, California, a complete change of manners that starts among the young and then overturns much of traditional morality within a few years, especially relating to sex and love. And it is these words, sex and love, which are going to haunt us ever since then. And in fact, the word love goes through all these changes in the 1960s. In the beginning, when Joan Baez is singing about love, she's often singing about, romantic love between a man and a woman, but she's also singing about loving your neighbor, kind of in the Christian sense, taking their cue from the civil rights movement. But by the end of it, as Janis Joplin says, basically, love is just finding someone to sleep with. Or as Stephen Stills wrote, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with, which begs the question, is there any fidelity left? And is this now the definition of love? And I can go through, someday maybe I will go through, songs that show how the word love was exploded by the time the Beatles sang All You Needed Love. And around the same time, the definition of the word love changed completely, which makes me real skeptical of the phrase love is love, because I'm sitting there going like, well, what in the hell do you mean by love? Is it just a contentless word? Does it just mean, sexual love? Or what do you mean by love? All the drug problems that have infested the world since then. Now, there's a prehistory to these things. Among jazz musicians, there were drugs. But the hippie movement just was a massive injection of drugs into the bloodstream, not only of America and England, but Western Europe, and eventually everywhere you go. It also creates a new open pornography. Prior to the 60s, pornography was something hidden away in the corner. It was, something some guys would find a magazine or some photos and they would giggle about it. You didn't see much in movies at all. Suddenly, there are, for instance, I remember in about 1970 being in San Francisco, seeing the Berkeley Barb and other newspapers, tabloids on the street being sold in these little boxes. And they had like nude people on the front doing weird stuff. And, I was like 15 years old going like, huh? What's this stuff? This is different than just a naked woman. This is something very different going on. And eventually in the 1970s, you would have people actually lining up to go see porno movies. And I was told by a guy from the Ukraine, when they opened up in the late 80s, early 90s, the first porno films had people lined up around the blocks to see things with titles like, A Woman and Two Men or something like this. Obviously that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. But now, of course, it's all online. These things start here. You don't need to go any further. And I would say that the entire hippie movement is part of the psychic damage of World War II. It is the younger people saying, Mommy, Daddy, why do I have to do things? And they would bring out little excuses from the past, like, well, we should all follow the 10 Commandments, or, we really should just be patriotic, and these kinds of things. And they didn't have any substance left behind them. And when the more people started thinking about the atomic bomb and Hiroshima, and the more they started thinking about the Holocaust, which they didn't do a lot of immediately after the war, they waited until about the 1960s before that started to really catch on as a subject of thought, And when confronted by these things, the old traditional views crumbled. They didn't crumble, I don't think, because, most of those things have a lot of strength to them. What didn't have a lot of strength was people's connections to these things. Most people were just materialists. The kind of modernist view, what you could see in like the old film noir movies, didn't leave you much to hold on to. It was just fate and gambling and drinking and cards, this kind of thing. There's not much there. You go to church on Sunday. It's just, and I remember I became a Christian in the Jesus movement around this time. And someone said, as long as you're not a fanatic about it. But that was the view from like the 1950s, the early 1960s before the hippies. Whereas meanwhile, everyone was being a fanatic about something in this new world. This whole period also gives the impetus to the second wave of feminism. It brings homosexuality out of the closet and into a movement. It brings revolutionary left-wing fervor out of the closet. It brings terrorism out of the closet. It brings student protests are happening all over the world, literally. Japan, South America, Mexico City. And in fact, 1968 was an annus horribilis, a horrifying year. Much like, but different than, 2020. I would say the last annus horribilis was 1968, because all the chickens from 1964 had come home to roost. There were assassinations, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. There were race riots, dozens and dozens of them after Martin Luther King's assassination. The Vietnam War was getting bloodier and bloodier, causing the president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to basically surrender and saying, I can't run for another term of this stuff. There were student protests and riots. France almost had a revolution. The Czech Republic was invaded by Russian tanks. Music eventually is getting darker, and yet on the other hand, it's getting more commercial. On one hand, it's getting darker. Underground, it's getting darker. Overground, it's getting more commercial. festivals go from Woodstock to Altamont in a few months in 1969. Oh yeah, and we landed on the moon. It's just like, oh yeah, was that a bit of good news, or does anyone remember that anymore? There's that great scene in what was it? Jim Carrey in Dumb and Dumber walks into a kind of a cafe or bar or something, and he sees someone's made a little poster out of headlines, land on the moon, and he looks at that and goes like, all right. It's kind of like, because by the 90s, it mattered so little that there were people who probably didn't even know if we landed on the moon or not.
No way. That's great. We landed on the moon!
And lastly came the Jesus movement, almost the thing which put the nail on the coffin of the 60s. But the 60s itself was already going down in flames. The rock stars, several of the most important ones, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, etc., were dying. Drug overdoses. Free love was turning out to be kind of a nightmare. The left-wing ideologues were producing, bombs. So yeah, it was kind of a problem. By 1970, the world of 1964 appeared to be about a century away. And what didn't change in the 1960s will probably change within the next 10 years. And all the morals and manners from the past are going to just simply be thrown under the bus. And so much so that I remember, going into churches by the 1980s, and the whole thing about, waiting until you got married for sex seemed to be just like thrown out the door. It's like we discovered something better. Well, to which I'm sitting there going like, yeah, you look at the results of that now and you go like, really? Was just, hooking up and hanging out, was that really better? I don't think so. Interestingly enough, the British Empire is over by about 1968 as well. And there's a devaluation of the pound. It goes from being worth about $4 to about $2.40 within the space of a few years. And, essentially saying, the British Empire, all that's left of the British Empire is the rock music and James Bond movies. And a little bit of, there's a little bit of stuff here and there, but it's being cleaned up. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War just goes on and on. Terrorism gets worse in the truthfully, the 1970s just seem apocalyptic. And you throw into that the gas crisis. Films get darker. But, of course, there's Watergate, Nixon's resignation. American politics is going down in flames. Finally comes the end of the Vietnam War. But the media becomes more respected and, more importantly, more powerful as a result of Watergate, because they're saying we essentially got Nixon. We convicted Nixon of his crimes. And like I say, the gas crisis is the first really serious blow to the American economy since the Great Depression. You can look back at the 70s and see all this apocalyptic stuff, and there's so much more. And yet, I remember it being a young adult, being the last period when real dialogue seemed possible among people. I remember those dialogues. I remember talking with people, arguing with people, having interesting discussions. But by the 1980s, that all kind of just evaporated. In a weird way, although the 1970s were a pretty terrible time, for music it was actually pretty great. I mean, a lot of great music was made in the 1970s. And especially the music of rebellion. Now, one thing that wasn't a rebellion was disco. That was music made by, shall we say, the white producers for people to just, it was the first shot over the bow of techno music. You still had your orchestras doing it. Eventually you would have the Giorgio Moroder, Munich sound and this kind of stuff. But
disco was this strange sort of subculture of, it was the decadence of the 60s being corralled into a marketable formula, a very serious marketable formula. You also had punk rock at this time. The important thing about punk rock is that it allowed everyone to go ahead and just say, fuck you. That is, say, everyone who's in the punk rock. But that attitude would eventually seep into the rest of culture. Now, there's a lot of great punk rock music, and there's a lot of, one thing I really did like from punk rock was the DIY attitude. But essentially that freedom to just go ahead and flip people off, I mean, it was starting to show up in the 60s, but it was still kind of funny then, whereas punk rock basically gave free vent to people's very serious anger to come out. And that never went back into the closet. When you look at the culture wars of today, they are supercharged by punk rock's hostility. You know, like I say, I love punk rock. And I'd much rather hear punk rock than 90% of what's being played today. I like the do-it-yourself attitude. I like the fact that it's like, okay, no one's going to make my record. I'll just go ahead and do it myself. But still, also born around 1979 is rap music, and in the South Bronx, which will also eventually spread globally. And it takes some of the hostility from punk, but it also takes the hostility of just ravaged environments, where who can afford a musical instrument? But we did find two turntables, and someone's got a microphone, so let's make music. Let's just redo this. It becomes a recombinant form of art, which becomes very important because I would say this is still, in some ways, kind of folk recycling of musical pieces, but it's a folk version of what will become a postmodern culture. And that's why one of the reasons why rap has remained so strong is because it was there creating this new recombinant culture, which we are going to find over and over. But coming in to save the day, or at least that's how it was portrayed, was Ronald Reagan after and he was like the new gunslinger. Also Maggie Thatcher over in England, this new nostalgic conservatism. And I say nostalgic because Reagan was a man, of the 1940s or 1950s, hadn't really changed his views since then. Came in and basically said, well, why can't we do this? Why can't we just tell the Russians to go back off? Why can't we, just simply tell people doing drugs, no, you're not going to do drugs anymore. And he didn't really understand what was happening. But at the same time, he had a great deal of success in dealing with the Russians who, unlike the Americans on the Democratic side or the Labour Party in England, the Russians only respect someone who wields a bit of power, and Reagan did. And so it helped to end the Cold War ultimately. But again, that's not a story for this. What's more important is that it also helped to breed the culture war and the propaganda machines. And so by this time, one of the things that's happened is the Christians, particularly the evangelical Christians, who'd been sitting on the sidelines through most of the 60s wondering what's happening to our children? Suddenly say, oh, well, some of them are becoming Christians through the Jesus movement. That's nice. But it's still not a political thing. And sometime in the second half of the 1970s, politics starts to enter the Christian evangelical world. It's also entering the Catholic world through the abortion controversy, and much less so, particularly in the West, in Orthodoxy, which has remained essentially on the sidelines. But abortion, feminism, and homosexuality, which I did a whole episode on, those are going to be the seedbed for this culture war that's going to mutate to the point where the people who were fighting each other in the 1990s are more and more seeing that they're on the same side of the fence compared with the new social justice folks, with the woke folks, with the transhumanist folks. You know, the darkness and cynicism of the 70s had moved from a more serious culture down to a pop culture. So you start to see this darkness show up in weird places like in genre movies, comedies, comic books, and underneath that in the rise of video games. And more, it's the kind of postmodern cynical humor that becomes prevalent. So that horror films by the end of the 80s are often horror comedies. And 80s culture was really weirdly split between kind of a willfully naive mainstream and a roiling underbelly that was completely ignored by mainstream culture. So under the surface of these, you know, the new blockbuster movies, you know, the Spielberg, Lucas kind of films, the ILM, Industrial Light and Magic movies, under the Rockies and the, you know, Rambos and all of the stuff that made the mainstream culture underneath the big hair and the post-new wave, neo-romantic video culture of MTV. Underneath that was hardcore punk and thrash metal, and goth and horror films. And this new term was starting to show up a bit. Geeks, people who are just obsessed with fantasy or obsessed with horror or obsessed with science fiction. Obsessed with collecting. I mean, I knew those people well because I was among them in many ways during the 1980s. There was, however, a moment of hope, and that was when, in 1989, the Iron Curtain cracked and opened. And one by one, the countries of Eastern Europe opened up, you know, Poland and Hungary and East Germany, and the Berlin Wall fell, and the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at that time, and eventually Romania, although that was the most violent of the changings, of the overturnings of the communist dictatorships. Unfortunately, it would also lead to a lot of strange stuff that would go on into the 90s in Yugoslavia, as Yugoslavia split up into different countries and essentially stayed actively, extremely violent through a lot of the 1990s. But this underbelly that I was talking about early from the 1980s would eventually become an extremely postmodern, extremely cynical culture of grunge, noise, indie comics, and zines. And it kind of, you could say, metaphorically, and in some sense in reality, it kind of ends when Kurt Cobain sucks on the shotgun. And yet, in a weird way, the early 90s are more like the 70s. That is to say, they're a time of strange imagery being pushed out, a kind of this apocalyptic culture coming out of from the underground coming up. And at the same time, it is a time that the culture war is going strong, but one can still talk a bit during this time. By the end of the 1990s, the underbelly things keep coming up, but there's a new juvenile attitude that's showing up as well. So those people who are collecting stuff, they're just kind of staying in a permanent state of juvenilia. Raves. It's like children going and just jumping up and down. Electronica, teen sex comedies, knowing teen horror of films and such. It's a very strange culture. Someone like Marilyn Manson, who does he appeal to? Teens. And yet it's very much the early 90s being mutated into this pop format, all the pop punk stuff and ska, neo-ska and whatever. And what's also happened is there's been a long train of ideas in modernism, going way back to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is looking and digging into the ancient classical past. And it inspires itself to new heights of art that the classical world never achieved. The reformers, the Protestants, are also inspired by the ancient past. They're inspired by the prophets of the Old Testament and the first century Christians. And they're trying to get out from under the medieval rule of the Catholic Church. The Enlightenment is inspired in a different way by the classical world. The Romantics would be inspired by the medieval world. People in the it just keeps going. There's a kind of a leapfrogging of movements. On one hand you have things like symbolism and surrealism, and on the other hand you have stuff like extreme modernism and abstraction. And they're kind of moving side by side throughout the 20th century, each going back into the past. The symbolist movement goes back to surrealist movement goes back to the symbolist movement, goes back to the romantic movement. By the time you get to the hippies, you find things like people going back to the 1920s and 30s. And you hear this in the music, you hear it in the clothes that they're borrowing. They're also going back to the Cowboys and Indian period, although emphasizing more the Indians, the Wild West. By the 1980s, people are going back to the early 60s. By the late 80s, they're going back to the late 60s. By the grunge era, they're going back to the 70s. The pop punk people are going back to the punk era. You can see what's happening. It's getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And to me, these are all modernist movements. But now what's happening is the Ouroboros, the snake swallowing its own tail, is finally spent, because now there is no more left to borrow. Interestingly enough, we came upon that moment in the late 90s, exactly at the same moment when we discovered the online world. The internet comes into being. And everything moves. All these different cultural phenomena have to move online. Especially things like conspiracies, cults, porn, file sharing, games. But everything else is moving online as well. And it starts to get so worrisome that some people start to fear that there's this Y2K bug. It's going to take us all out in the year 2000, which is really funny, because compared to the year 2000, compared to now, how much we're connected to the online world, we hardly seem connected at all at that point. If we'd been taken out then, it would have just been like, okay, this would take us a few years to get back. Now, it would bring down most of the societies of the world in a very serious way. I still have this weird thought. I first started going online and looking at a few things, going onto computers about 1995. In 1996, I ended up in Alaska. In 1997, we got new Macs in our Alaskan radio station, and I just started to discover the internet at that point. And there's still this weird thing in me that says, well, hopefully this stuff is all going to end soon, and we can get back to life. It isn't going to happen. Not that way, anyway. And then came the second blow. I told you, spoiler. September 11th, 2001. And this is a wild moment. Never before have we seen 200-story buildings attacked and fall to the ground. I go into great detail of this. And this fuels just endless conspiracies. I mean, if you've got any, don't share them. I'm pretty sure we're all tired of them. It also fuels the wars, the forever wars that are going to dominate the next 20 years. Iraq and Afghanistan. But it also changes the politics of the world. That moment at the end of the 90s is starting to look like, oh, we had some possibility then. We weren't in the middle of anything major. And now it's starting to look like the last gasp of a certain moment. Although the early aughts culture was not very different from the late 90s, except that The teen culture part became much more commercial and much more X-rated, often focusing on these public divas, or I like to call them the heterae, the noble prostitutes, the noble whores of popular culture. Music is now consumed by people. It's no longer the rock concert, the rock festival. It's not even just the rave. It's now consumed mostly as if it's our personal soundtrack. First through the iPod. This goes back to the Walkman and things like this, the transistor radio, the Walkman, then the iPod. But then quickly after that came the iPhone. Bam! Everything changes at the iPhone. And I think, like I say, had Y2K happened in the year 2000, not much would have changed. I mean, people would have said, oh, we were starting to get into technology and then the whole thing went down and we're trying to figure it out again. And we probably would have. But now everything is connected. Everything is connected. And that is not good news. Social media is born in the late aughts, from MySpace to Facebook to YouTube to Twitter to Instagram. The financial crisis of 2008 is largely caused by the online world. That is to say, it's caused by the fact that people can just go online and say, oh, buy now. Oh, set up this program to make me buy now. So we entered this weird world by the time of 2010. In 2011, three big things happened. Osama bin Laden is captured and killed. The Arab Spring starts, and Occupy Wall Street happens. And all of these are going to have a great deal of significance to the future. Osama bin Laden's significance is that spells the end of the September 11th era, which is one of the reasons why when in 2020, the September 11th celebration, commemorative, memorial, was essentially forgotten about because it was no longer what it was. Now, it is, and we did do a 20th anniversary of it this year, but what's strange is things have changed so much since 2010. For instance, Occupy Wall Street goes from being a fairly righteous, like, who's going to take responsibility for the 2008 financial crisis, to the new social justice configuration, the Hydra. By 2014, this new culture of offense has come into being with issues surrounding race, gender, identity, immigration. Interestingly enough, this was already there. That is to say, you can go back to the 90s and see a lot of this. Camille Paglia, again, was talking about, she thought they had dealt with it in the 90s because, they had come along with a different kind of feminism, one that was open more to the masculine. But instead what had happened was all the people who had these old politically correct ideas went into the universities and ended up getting tenure and teaching all of this trash to the younger students. Essentially, it's the revenge of the movements from the 60s and 70s. It's like, no, you're not just going to pull the capitalist wool over our eyes. We want social justice. So a variety of places and causes come to the fore. There's Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, trans bathrooms, the Me Too movement, all these things coming at the second part of the teens. Also, a second culture is being formed in the bowels of the gaming world in reaction to this culture of offense. And it's a culture of humor and mockery related to going back to the 90s and the early aughts. That is to say, they're going back and bringing this in. They're saying, hey, wait a minute. When did it become illegal just to speak and make jokes? To which the new woke Hydra says, do what you want. We're taking over everything. We've got the universities, we've got the mainstream media, we've got education, we've got big tech. And so they started putting pressure on those people. So many kind of culturally drift during this period, but it's been coming ever since the 60s, this cultural drift into perpetual adolescence. If you go back to the point at which psychedelics was introduced into the bloodstream of America in the late 1960s, the first thing you see everyone doing is acting like stoned, carefree, naive, innocent, quote unquote, children. And of course, the problem with that is many of these people would grow up and breed those people who were their children to expect that one should have the ability to just live the way you want to live. There are no responsibilities. Well, there are responsibilities, but you have to, there are social responsibilities. But more people have started to become caught in this machine of perpetual juvenilia, perpetual childhood. Superhero movies become the biggest thing in the country, and fantasy is the order of the day. There's just so much here, I don't have to mention it again. Pop culture becomes either toy-like or sentimental and sticky by the late teens of the 21st century. It's this weird, when I hear music now by so many of the people who are popular, so much of it is just this weird kind of yearning in a hopeless way, at the same time a bit sensual, and musically it's not interesting. And I'm not just saying that because I'm old. I can listen to music from the 1920s. I can listen to music from the Middle Ages or the Baroque era. I can listen to, music hall from England in the 1930s. I can listen to almost anything. I find that so much of the music being sold to people today it's just the attitude of it. It's just so, and it's not, there's no originality to the music, but the attitude is all like, we want to believe, we want to change things, it's this weird thing inside of it. And then, of course, the nightmare of every social justice warrior happens. Donald Trump is elected president, and you start getting events like Charlottesville, which separates the alt-right from the anti-woke. So what had been kind of all mixed together now is like, no, we're not alt-right, but we don't like the woke stuff. Also, though, it ignites the Antifa protests. It causes people on the BLM front to get more hostile. Most of the major news media is becoming so biased that it becomes clear to more and more people just how weird things have become. For instance, let's say you're listening to this and you really thought Trump was an idiot. I can understand that as very well. I'm not a huge fan of Trump, but I don't think he is what the media portrayed him as. For instance, they spent 3 years trying to get him on, quote, possible Russia collusion. And it all ends up disappearing. Did anyone who spread that mythology, that conspiracy theory, ever A, claim it was a conspiracy theory, B, apologize? Maybe 1 or 2 people did, but most of the people in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, all of these different organizations basically just rolled with this stuff. Now, on the other side, you just have Fox News and a couple of other people. It's like 90% of the media in our country was all inside this weird echo chamber of just, Trump derangement syndrome. And not everything he did was bad. I am absolutely convinced, had he been president in 2021, what happened in Afghanistan would not have been what the farce it became. But essentially what had happened by 1919 is you have 2 different societies. They're all formed by propaganda of one form or another. There are people on the right with absolutely ridiculous conspiracy theories like the growing QAnon theory. There are people on the left who have what some people have called the blue anon theory, which is that everything that right-wing people do is evil. Not we disagree with it, but it's actively evil. And in doing so, they kind of create that illusion of themselves as well. And it's interesting. I started thinking about this in the 90s. In the 1860s in Russia, it was a period of extreme social upheaval. The serfs were liberated around that time. There were Russian revolutionaries going about things. And more happened off and on, all the way up until it grew until 1917, when there was a major revolution. And then that led to a civil war. And in the 1990s, I suddenly looked back at the 1960s and said, I don't know, 2017? Because it struck me as being very similar, the periods. Now, radically different because the countries are radically different. But, yeah, this long road to revolution. Well, that's what they wanted to happen. And it looked like it was almost on the road to that. And then Trump comes in and derails the whole thing. And there was a black guy, I can't remember his name, but he was just a normal black guy on a YouTube channel who said, like, Trump may not be the best president, but he is the best president for the times, because he so derailed what was coming that it threw us into, well, the third major blow, which is the year 2020, the pandemic, plus an annus horribilis, all together in one. And that's what we're going to now do. We're going to stop all this. I've tried to summarize. There's a lot more I could say. All of these things lead us to where we are. Kennedy's assassination, for instance, opens the door on conspiracy theories to make them possible. And conspiracy theories now are what people live by. Punk rock, as I said before, opens the door so that people no longer have to treat each other civilly anymore. They can just say, flip the finger and say, go F yourself. The culture war that started off with homosexuality, feminism, and abortion kind of slipped the rails and then became this weird social justice hydra, including a redefinition of what it means to be male or female. Now, many of the people who fought against each other in the 90s, I can suddenly think of all sorts of people, who are gay or lesbian or were libertarians or something, are making alliances with Christians and right-wingers and fiscal, conservatives. And I'm sitting there going, what's going on? Well, what's going on is a much greater monster has showed up. And we don't know if we're going to be swallowed up by it. And that is the result of what 2020 means to us. So let's get into that.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
I like when famous people tell me how to feel. They are famous and I know who famous people are, so I listen to them. Famous people know more than me because they're famous. I'm strong and empowered because a famous person said I was.
Coffee.
Oh no, Charlotte!